You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs. All right, here we are. I'm very excited to be back for our episode on yoga for athletes. I've got a couple of fantastic visitors with me today, a couple of our yoga medicine therapeutic specialists, two teachers who have been with us for a very long time, who also are instructors for yoga medicine. Jenni Tarma is one of our instructors on Yoga Medicine Online, and she's an endurance athlete. She's a CrossFit trainer. She works with both collegiate and professional athletes and teams. She works at a very high level, as well as with, the recreational athletes like you or me, maybe potentially with weightlifters. And she also has a company that trains and specializes in providing customized, specific mobility work and recovery work called Kari Prehab, and that's Kaari. It's a Finnish name, and she's got a lot of programming to support athletes there. And then we also have Allison Haleg. Am I saying that right? Did I just say that wrong?
Heilig.
Heilig. I feel like I just said it wrong. Oh, okay. Well, you can tell this is very, very conversational, casual. I don't think I've ever said your name out loud in all the years that I've known you. I've never said your last name out loud.
Yeah, and I think we just introduce ourselves by first names usually too, right? So I probably never said it to you.
That's okay. Okay. We're here. And anyway, Allison is a very accomplished ultra marathoner and weightlifter. She's a strength and endurance coach and a certified running coach, a corrective exercise specialist, as well as a certified nutritional coach. And on and on. They both have many qualifications. She also works with both competitive and recreational athletes to develop sustainable training. And, this is kind of the theme with both Jenni and Allison, as well as with yoga medicine, is how do we help athletes train to stay strong and healthy and durable and resilient in their sports. I know Allison has a book actually called The Durable Runner, which is just about that too. And founder of Miles to Go Athletics. So both of these wonderful women here today are very much experts in their field. And I have a little bit of experience working with athletes, but it's one of my favorite topics to look at. I've specialized in sports medicine for about almost 2 decades now. And I was just thinking about this recently because I was working at Nike. I started their Chinese medicine program and did a lot of yoga for athletes. And when I started there, I think it was in 2006, when I started there, yoga was a very hard sell. Like a very hard sell. And I feel like 2006 was when yoga was first kind of starting to catch a wave of popularity. But it took a while at Nike. And I remember starting some of my yoga for athletes classes there. And when I picked them up, and it was already going, it was already class when I got there. And when I picked it up, there were like 3 or 4 people who would come. And over the years I was there, about 7 years, they were packed classes. Eventually, it's not just me, it was the popularity of yoga as well, I think. But for me, athletes who start to practice and get familiar with the practice, there's obviously a steep learning curve. I think just getting to familiarize yourself with a lot of the yoga terms and postures and movements. But once they start to feel its impacts in their body, it's kind of hard to stop. My athlete clients and my athlete patients are the ones that are always there. They are the ones who are committed. And so it's a really interesting demographic, I think, to work with as a yoga teacher. It's always been a demographic that I loved working with and still love working with. And whether it's professional athletes or casual athletes. So what we're going to talk about today, we've got some really fun, just conversational tidbits to look at. We're going to talk a bit about this kind of idea of flexibility versus stiffness, which is such an important thing to look at with athletes. We're going to talk a bit about recovery. We're going to talk about cross training. We're going to talk about myofascial release, and then some important takeaways for athletes along the way to give you kind of a quick summary of some of the things that can be most helpful. And of course, as always, if you want more science, more details, more nuances, we have our course on yoga for athletes, our teacher training online now, or you can wait and do it in person. So lots of great stuff. Let's jump right in and kick it off and start by talking about, I think, this misunderstood concept of flexibility and stiffness as it relates specifically to athletes. There's a lot to chew on there.
Yeah, so I think that as a society in general, we are doing ourselves a pretty huge disservice in terms of the way that we talk about flexibility and stiffness, where the colloquial use of the words like stiff and tight is like a very, very negative one. When, of course, the reality is that, well, first of all, tension is a completely subjective feeling. Like, we're describing a sensation as opposed to a mechanical condition in the tissues. So that's like one thing, is that when people say that they feel tight or stiff, there's a lot of gray area included in that statement right off the bat. And then, of course, the other thing is that athletes actually really need and benefit from tension and stiffness in their tissues. That's a very desirable biomechanical characteristic, especially of connective tissue. And it's really what allows them to perform well. It's what gives them efficiency in movement. So the needs of those types of athletes are very different. Like, that's really at odds if you think about the general population who, when they come to classes, there was a big survey on yoga done a few years ago that basically found that the number one reason for people starting a yoga practice is to increase flexibility. So I think that brings up some really interesting dichotomies about, like, lots of athletes know that yoga is, in air quotes, good for them. They should do it because it's really helpful for them. And then you also hear of athletes who go to a group yoga class and have a bad experience. Like, they are often too tired. They've probably already trained that day, whereas the other people there, that's like their workout for the day. They're too stiff for a lot of the poses that are included, which doesn't sit well with their like type A ambitious mindset that they bring to their movement practice. So you can see how there's a lot of room and potential for the notion to be reinforced in the athlete's mind that yoga is not something that's for them, or it doesn't feel relevant to them. So I think that we have to kind of reframe flexibility and stiffness in slightly different terms for this particular demographic and like a general population class, which I'm not saying that as a negative thing at all, but that's not necessarily going to serve the needs of the athlete in the best way possible.
Yeah, and I think if we back up too and just remember that stiffness is that resistance to deformation of the tissues. It really is a very simple term, but what we're talking about too is their ability to more quickly rebound and then also lose less energy. So when we're talking about stiffness as an athlete, we're talking about something that's actually a really precious commodity in most sports. Now, obviously, like Jenni said, it kind of depends on what kind of balance you need between mobility and stiffness, because as I become stiffer, I obviously lose some of that compliance, which is that ability to now bend more easily and have more mobility. Obviously, mobility can be movement specific as well. So kind of depends on the part of the body you're talking about. But in general, what we're talking about is tissues that are more economical. So if I have too much compliance in the tissues, they're losing a lot of energy. So, for my Achilles tendon, I want to have tissues that are more like a rubber band. So I have that quick rebound and less like a gummy bear, which I think is a great analogy because like no one wants gummy bears in their Achilles tendon. It's a very obvious one, but there is that trade-off. And so for athletes, some of that stiffness is a very precious commodity. And I think it's important just to rewrite that relationship. And as yogis too, it's not all about compliance. There's a balance depending on what you want to do for most of your day. Where that will be on the spectrum will be a little different for each person.
And I think also with athletes, they develop mobility and like movement capability in these very specific ways that are relevant to the sport and the movements that they're doing in their sport. And that can absolutely create a situation where you then subsequently feel stiffer in other movements, or maybe just like less flexible in those other movements, which is the thing that you'll run up against when you go into just a general yoga class where like you're doing things where suddenly it's like, that's not going to work for me at all. And that creates a dichotomy as well, because I mean, even on a personal level, I've experienced this where I don't feel at all limited or stiff when I'm like playing the sports that I do or engaging in the activities that I do. But even as a yoga teacher, I would be considered like very, very stiff. And I do feel limitation in even what would be considered like moderately challenging yoga asana. So those things come up in different contexts. So yeah, I think it's important for us to consider the needs and limitations of the athlete as well as the experience that they're having and how we work with them.
Yeah. And when I start working with somebody, a lot of times there's this, they come to me because a lot of the people that come to me because I'm a durability coach. And so they come and they say things like, I keep getting hurt. So I know I need to work on my flexibility. And they start to connect those dots as if, this lack of flexibility is the reason why they keep having injury issues. And as you start to dig into that conversation, the question becomes, are we even talking about a lack of flexibility, or is this a mobility issue, right? So there's this differentiation between, is it the flexibility of the tissues, or is it that you're moving your joints through a very specific range of motion, especially with what I work with is mostly endurance athletes. You're doing the same movement thousands of times, and it's actually a relatively small amount of range of motion just repeated over and over again. And so when we start to move you through more closer to end range of motion, you're going to feel stiff. You're very specialized in that middle area in one plane for the most part. And so there is going to be this feeling of stiffness when you're outside of that specialization.
But and you want that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's what makes you efficient as an endurance athlete. If you lack that recoil, you have to use more muscular power. Your tendons are amplifying your muscular power and your muscular strength. And without that amplification, without that stiffness, you have to expend more energy to move your body. So the fuel efficiency changes in those situations, and you get really, really efficient at that one small piece of range of motion, which again is the point of the athletic training that you're doing. So as we go round and round in that conversation, is flexibility really what's making you feel like you're getting hurt all the time and stiff, or is it more an issue of maybe you're just a little stiffer in certain ranges of motion, or there's certain mobility that you're not accessing as often? And, I'm sure we'll talk more about this as we get into the conversation, we get into cross training. I think that's where, is it stretching you need, or is it more cross training, just moving in different planes and different ranges of motion to help minimize some of those feelings of stiffness, and to help minimize any overtraining issues that might happen as a result of that repetitive movement?
I love that. And I think what I'm hearing from you too, which resonates with my work with athletes too, is that it really is a mindset change that I really think, a lot of athletes can benefit from stretching. What that form is and how it looks and where it looks and how far they go and how much they push themselves, it kind of depends on the person and what their goals are. But I think not approaching it looking to get something other than some cross training or flexibility, maybe not looking to get like a certain shape or a certain desired outcome instantly. I think for athletes is the big thing. You know, it's so hard to break that mentality of like needing to touch your toes or needing to get to a certain place. And it's one of the reasons why I love classes for athletes. And I've never, well, I have done some sports specific ones, but mostly I've taught them just for all athletes, which I think is really wonderful. It basically just means yoga for tight people, you know, like, and then you're surrounded by people who are using blocks, who are bending their knees instead of being next to like the really flexible, you know, in quotes, yoga people. That changes your expectations and how you approach it. And, you know, I think obviously there's a lot more to yoga for athletes, but I think that in and of itself can be very, very helpful.
And I think that totally comes back to this idea of like reframing what flexibility really means in the context of working with athletes too, because I think it's worth pointing out too, that the sort of subtext or the undercurrent with all of this too, is that like what these people are bringing to their practice are these often pretty unrealistic notions of what average or normal flexibility or range of motion looks like that we get from society as well. So there's a little bit of dismantling of that needs to happen even before we get to the sport specific stuff and talking about how, you know, stiffness is actually good.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's also something really interesting about what happens. We were talking about this before the call, actually, Jenni and Allison too, is this idea that also just having more awareness as you become, you know, more familiar with your yoga practice, you're starting to practice more. It also predisposes you to really feeling more stiff because now you've got more awareness of what's going on. And so maybe you didn't notice that stiffness before, but now all of a sudden you're there, you're feeling it, you're noticing it. I think everything's kind of changing just as we start to become more mindful.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's just kind of like a personal opinion of mine that I've had, which is that when you, well, A, have better body awareness, and B, are moving more frequently, you're just giving yourself more like markers and more check-in points. And that in and of itself is going to predispose you to experiencing yourself as being more stiff, just because you have more reference points and more understanding and more awareness. And you might compare like a very active person who like feels super stiff to somebody who maybe like doesn't move around a lot or doesn't really test the boundaries of their range of motion in any like meaningful or significant way. And that person will probably say like, oh, I feel fine. Like I'm not stiff at all. But it's just because they didn't try to go there and meet any resistance, which of course for athletes, like even I would say amateur athletes who are moving on a regular basis have more highly developed body awareness and subsequently just more of those internal markers for how their body feels on a day-to-day basis.
So, you know, I think there's a lot around this mindset shift. We could talk a lot about flexibility versus stiffness, but I think that makes a nice, good little segment there just to remind that there is a mindset change that has to happen, that stiffness isn't necessarily a bad thing, that it is your friend. And if you can befriend that as an athlete, it will serve you so well. And, you know, I've seen this, we've all seen this who teach to athletes regularly. If you can get people to embody that one concept, I think it's one really powerful practice tool. It's just harder to kind of implement than I think most of us think. We have another episode too on stretching specifically, so I don't want to go too much into stretching, but keep in mind there's a lot of different ways that you can implement this. I do still think there's an important place for flexibility work in quotes. So remember, flexibility is just that ability to adapt in many ways, but what we're talking about is also that mobility, which is the ability to be moved, which doesn't really tell us if it's active or passive. And for athletes, you know, you need both. You need the passive mobility before you can actively control it. So I think, you know, there's a lot of wonderful conversations around mobility and flexibility and stretching that we've talked about in other episodes. But for athletes, I think just as we've said, shifting that relationship to how we look at flexibility and stiffness is a really big part of it. And how you do that as a teacher, if you're a teacher, I mean, be patient. It does take time. You have to plant seeds. And I think just demoing, if you're not an athlete, like maybe go out and do a few runs or do something so that you can have some compassion and channel that. I know even myself, I've always been on the more flexible side, even, even when I have been more active. So, I like to just make sure I'm demoing with knees bent and with options and blocks rather than to my fullest capacity, which is important, because you may have a slightly different range of motion. Even if you are a runner, you might have a different range of motion than the typical runner if you're more flexible. So keeping those things in mind, I think, is important. Now, the next topic that I think is really important to look at with athletes is recovery. Yoga, I think, this is a gold mine for athletes now, especially when we look at really high level competitive professional athletes where they're training, and maxing out their training capacity. The more that I can enhance that recovery, the more I can also potentially enhance training and performance and outcomes as a result. And any athlete who, especially endurance athletes or athletes who are highly competitive, who train a lot, are very familiar with this. And, I think recovery is such an important one now that yoga is becoming more familiar to athletes for, and rightfully so. I'm sure you guys have both experienced this.
Yeah, I found that in recent years, recovery is not as hard of a sell anymore as it used to be, and particularly using yoga as a recovery modality. And because it's a conversation that's happening quite frequently now in the sports world, and you hear people talking more about it. You hear people in food and in modalities and in different things that you can buy. And so there's a lot of conversation around recovery. And so I feel like that message of how important recovery is getting sent home to people. They're getting it now, and they're looking for something accessible that they can do. I know, right? So because
the battle's over now.
You'll never be able to outtrain your ability to recover. So it's really, when I'm working with an athlete, it's especially in like my field or my specialty is ultra running. And so these are races that are longer than marathons. And so the training for them involves an enormous amount of running and strength training because I'm a trail athlete. So I can't keep training if I can't recover fast enough. So for me, training is like a race to recover before my next session. And what I find, though, the piece that's still really missing for the people that I work with is having some specific plan around it. And this is where in my coaching, I really focus on when you have a rest day, what does that mean? Because I work with a lot of people like myself that have full-time jobs and they have families and they have their sport. And so their rest day, sometimes if I don't give them something specific to do to help them recover, they use their rest day to run errands, to do yard work, to, do all of these things, because let's face it, training is time intensive and we have people around us that still want our attention. So, we'll take that time and we don't necessarily sit on the couch. We use it as a catch-up day. And this idea that time passing is a recovery modality. And I think we can do so much better than that. So what I've really been focusing on, and what I would say to people, to coaches, to yoga teachers, that are working with athletes and athletes themselves, is to approach your recovery with the same level of precision and structure and programming that you do with the rest of your training. So instead of it being like, here are your splits and here are the hill repeats you're doing, and then here's the rest periods you're doing, which are all precisely laid out in a plan. Like, here's your paces, log everything. And then, recover. Okay. And then the next day you're going to get on the bike and you're going to do these splits at these paces and it kind of creates this feeling that like the recovery is an afterthought.
Yeah.
That it's not part or integrated into the training plan. It's just something that you do when you're not training, and just not training is enough to recover. But
yeah, it just happens on its own.
Yeah.
Somehow.
That it's this passive process that just washes over you. And to some degree it is. I mean, we have a system that's designed for resilience and for recovery. But in this quest to push ourselves to greater and greater levels of performance, we can and we should do a little bit better with that and have some structure around the recovery aspect. And for me, it's as simple as giving my athletes 3 poses they need to do. So it's like 10 minutes of time, 3 poses they need to do, and being precise about what they are and how long they're in them, and giving that structure to the recovery, that the same amount of structure and attention to the recovery that comes in the training, so that it appears to be, and it becomes an integrated part of what the athlete's doing.
Yeah. And I think this is what you and Jenni both do so well in your careers, is really guiding people to do just that. It's so hard because, as an athlete, you spend so much time planning out your training regimen. The last thing you want to do is think about planning out your recovery. So to have someone, whether that's a coach for your training, but also maybe someone to help with the recovery, I think is such a vital part of it. Now, obviously there's levels of athletes. For someone who's a casual athlete, sure, like you said, the recovery process can happen on its own, or maybe you just, join an online yoga membership and do some gentle restorative or active recovery. We've got a ton on Yoga Medicine Online now, I know, but like even just any kind of gentle-ish yoga, like a slow flow can be a great form of active recovery to kind of clear out the metabolites in the tissues there, or a restorative for when you're feeling more depleted. And I think for non-competitive athletes, it's nice too, because it's also recovery for life. Like we have other stressors for most of us. I know at Nike, I worked with a lot of people who were pro athletes on top of being full-time employees. I worked with a woman who swam the English Channel there, and almost back. She almost broke the record, but she was incredible. But she was also like a really high caliber executive at Nike. And, there's all these other stresses, or we're moms, or we're dads, or we're, all these other things that we do in our lives. So I think it's so important. And this is what we do so well. And we can analyze it and break it down scientifically and talk about all the details of different types of recovery, but in a very simplistic way. I think any kind of gentle-ish yoga practice can be a way to do that. We know that there are a lot of practices to down-regulate the nervous system. The idea is that we want to be able to go from this hyperdrive, this SNS, the sympathetic, to this relaxation, the PNS, and any way that you find helpful to do that, I think. And that's kind of our job as teachers, is kind of finding the way that works for that person, whether that's meditation or pranayama or slow flow or yin or restorative. Like all of those can be very helpful depending on, and obviously there's a lot more details to this, but where they're at in their training cycle, what they need, what their goals are. Like you said, Allison, like be specific. If you need to. If not, just find what works.
Yeah, and I mean, athletes are used to this. They're used to having a structure, checking things off the list. They love this stuff. You don't stay in competitive athletics, even me in a recreational capacity, you don't stay in them for a long period of time if you hate structure and you hate having a program and a plan. I mean, we're so used to having coaches telling us, what to be eating, and coaches telling us how to train a certain way and how to cross train and how to strength train. And so we're used to this. We're used to having somebody there guiding that process. And I think a yoga teacher really stands in so well into that spot, especially in recovery, where the other people that we would have on our team of coaches are just not as equipped.
Yes.
They don't have as many tools in their toolbox. This is not their thing.
This is where we shine.
Yeah. Oh,
and
for sure.
it's something I'm always saying to people, like it's rare for whatever reason. I don't know of many or any offhand. I'm sure there are. I don't know of many teacher trainings, yoga teacher trainings, training teachers to work with athletes. And so I'm always, when I do the training, always like, don't be afraid to talk about your credentials, list them online, because these teams, these professional athletes, these schools, these teams, like they want someone who has been trained to work with athletes, and like they're dying for it. There's so much interest for this in the world of athletes now. And I know, for myself, I've worked with a bunch of different types of athletes, and the recovery is such a big part of it. I worked with a handful of professional football players, and it's such a big part. If you can imagine, like in an impact sport like that too, much less, the repetitive motion of all of these sports to some degree, like you've got to have a strong recovery protocol nowadays in professional athletics.
And there's so much science around performance enhancement now. And then there's so many coaches that can speak to that, to this high level, and just wow you with the information that they have and that's out there, because it's so studied, right? I mean, there's a lot of money in sports performance. So there's a lot of scientific study to back different protocols and different modalities. And there's just this piece missing, on that recovery side. And as yoga teachers, particularly teachers that have gone through yoga medicine's trainings, we have so much to say and so much that we know that we can come into this environment with athletes and speak with authority on these subjects, because we have what people are looking for. We have that missing piece, and we have lots of different ways to approach it. So it's not a cookie cutter approach to each athlete or each sport. It's, what does this athlete need? What are they already getting? And how can I give them something that they can do and that they can really feel the benefit of?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And actually, just to piggyback off of what you were saying, Allison, one of the most common things that I hear from the people that come to us is that if they need help with their recovery routine, well, first of all, that indicates that they already understand the significance of it. So as you said, it's not a hard sell, but they don't know what the specifics are. Like, they don't know how to go about it themselves. So they want that expert opinion. And as you mentioned, these are people who really thrive on specificity and structure and having like a tangible thing that they can check off the list. So it's really just giving them that structure. And I love this idea, like what Tiffany was saying, that for maybe the recreational athlete, unless you are somehow like elite to the point where you have doctors measuring your various physiological markers of recovery, being recovered is pretty much just like your own subjective assessment of how you feel. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually, that gray area is really nice, because it totally empowers that person to try out a bunch of different things, whether it's like a yin class or a restorative class or like a slow flow class, and just figure out what actually works for them, where they can then make intelligent decisions about like what helps them to feel quote unquote recovered, knowing that feeling is going to be like highly specific to them too. So the whole thing can exist on this scale where it can be like highly specific for somebody who has a very regimented training routine at a high level, versus somebody who just like likes to get out there and go for a run a couple of times a week or something like that. So it can look so many different ways. And I could not agree more that this is where yoga teachers, especially ones who are really trained in this, can make such a valuable contribution.
Yeah. Yes. This is a gold mine. If you talk about recovery, like if you just understand it a little bit, obviously it's kind of beyond the length of even a 1 hour podcast to talk about all the details of recovery. But, like Jenni said, what I love to do is on these podcasts, be able to give teachers something they can work with. And I think what you said too is important, that experimenting. I find with certain athletes, like they love restorative, or they love yin, or they hate restorative, or they hate pranayama. Like they hate doing breath work. I've worked with professional athletes that cannot do a 3-count inhale and a 3-count exhale to save their life. Like it's very difficult, or, especially if they're asthmatic, And so, obviously that's a point that you might want to work to later, knowing that it's very difficult. However, maybe it's not the first place you want to start. Maybe I want to just train them to relax first. So start with what they like, because that's what they'll do. And the consistency is really important. So whether that's restorative or yin or pranayama or meditation is becoming really big in the sports world too. So there's a lot of benefits to all of those, or even myofascial release. Myofascial release, and maybe we'll move on to that topic next, but myofascial release is such a great one for athletes. And I also feel like many times, and it does depend on the athlete, probably not so much in the CrossFit world, which you live in, Jenni, but I've worked with a lot of athletes that have a full entourage of doctors and trainers and people that work with them all day, every day, massage therapists, and don't do myofascial release. And I'm like, my brain just explodes. Like, how do you not? Everyone loves myofascial release.
What
it's
a
like
giant missed opportunity.
the easiest selling point, like everyone loves it. They feel it right away. You get the immediate benefits. Like you get that instant gratification from it. Like the buy-in is easy.
It's the lowest hanging fruit there is, as far as this particular demographic, in my opinion.
Yeah. And it's a great way. There's actually been some decent research on it being one way to instigate the relaxation response, the parasympathetic, especially with this slow, deep pressure. So rather than just scribbling and gripping and pushing, but being able to kind of like slowly sink in and move through the tissues can be a great way to stimulate those Ruffini endings to instigate some of that parasympathetic response. So let's talk about MFR in general. I think that's a good segue to like MFR for athletes. One, again, a very valuable one. What else do you guys love about MFR for athletes?
I think this is an interesting one because with all of the different like gizmos and gadgets you can buy out there for soft tissue work, there's a lot of questions now coming up around myofascial release. So with the the Theraguns, and which just when I watch people use them, there's just this part of me that's like, can I show you something? Because for me, in my experience with it is in a CrossFit gym, we're about to do a workout and somebody is just pulverizing their quads before that workout. And I think about all the training that I've had in myofascial release and the different, like you said, the Ruffini endings and that slow, deep pressure, and that there's a lot you can do with myofascial release, not necessarily right before you're about to do a really heavy WOD, but as part of your recovery as well. And there's so many people now that already have a familiarity with, in every CrossFit gym, there are lacrosse balls there and it's this running joke of like, just stick a lacrosse ball in it and roll around, and it's got sort of this, I don't know, it got kind of a bad reputation, I think, at a certain point because of the way that it was being applied. But there's really so much that we can get out of it. And especially for athletes that have this kind of this heightened or high performance output all the time, to just be still. And even in like a yin stretch or restorative pose, sometimes that can be a really hard transition to make out of your life and into, or out of your life or out of your training and into this like still quiet space. Whereas myofascial release can really provide some stimulation to the nervous system in a way that can help to ease that transition from this high output, high performance sympathetic nervous system activation that they live their lives in and that they train in, down into something that is, more conducive to recovery and to stillness, by allowing there to be some form of mechanical stimulation to the tissues instead of it being this abrupt shift from, loud and fast to still and quiet. So I think that the way that it eases the transition is a really big piece of it. And that it's not as goal oriented as being in certain stretches So you're not necessarily trying to look a certain way from the outside. You're not necessarily comparing yourself to the people around you, but you're just in the experience of that pressure, of the tissues, of what
Mm-hmm.
you're feeling in your body when you take the pressure off. I love when we do one side and then pause for a moment and just notice the sensations, because it really gives people this view, this front row seat to this experience that otherwise they might just kind of skip over if we were to just kind of move on to the next thing.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of like what we said before. It really takes these simple things. This is why I love the podcast. Like, obviously, we can't go into like details and show poses and specifics, which isn't needed on a podcast. But what we're doing is laying the groundwork. And I think we keep coming back to these mindset shifts, which are, whether you're an athlete listening, a very helpful tool to carry around with you, or a yoga teacher listening, something that you'll plant seeds on is, that this is part of your recovery now. That MFR, what ends up happening, kind of like yoga, is as athletes, we tend to approach it as this thing that we have to conquer, right? That we have to be able to accomplish. When, again, if we can shift that mindset to this being a part of your recovery, this like really clear, like yin and yang segue from the doing to the being. And, like you said, we see this all the time. I know Jenni's nodding in agreement too. Like, we see the athletes come in and they're just like digging in, right? Like, more is not necessarily better, especially if you've listened to some of the podcasts on MFR and fascia. You've heard a lot about the beauty of this precious tissue and all that it can do. So a mindset shift, I think, is what we're talking about here, really.
Yeah, and I like personally do not want to see another spiked foam roller like anywhere for the rest of my life. So I totally agree with you that as a transitional tool, it's so valuable because Allison already talked about the fact that it's a really good modality with which to create like immediate buy-in. It's very like motivational for athletes to like feel the effects right away. And keeping in mind too that these are individuals who not only really enjoy intense sensation to some degree, but that's the context in which they're used to connecting with and experiencing their bodies. So giving them some MFR is kind of like scratching that itch and at least putting to rest that voice of like, I don't feel anything, so nothing's happening and this is pointless. But then it's allowing for that little downshift into like the more subtle awareness. And you guys already even mentioned like that comparative mindset that can kick in during like a stretching class or yoga asana class. There's really nothing to compare to when it's just like you doing myofascial release. Like, it's gonna look kind of the same on everybody. So your only point of reference is like, how does it feel and how do I adjust from there? So it's kind of sneaking in that little mindfulness component as well and starting to create the opportunity for the individual to sort of tune into their internal experience in a little bit more detail. So it's like a nice gateway tool to getting them to just kind of tune in a little bit more detail. Yeah.
I feel like this is one we're always talking about, even in the non-MFR modules that we do at Yoga Medicine. Like, I'm always talking about it in spine and hip and shoulder because it really creates that buy-in with clients that you're working with. If you're a teacher, people unanimously love MFR. There's like 1 in 1,000 that maybe for whatever reason don't like it. It's so rare. It's almost like it's almost hard to remember those students in your memory that didn't like it. But, there's always exceptions to the rule, but people love it. And the great thing is they feel the effects right away. And so that it helps develop that muscle of compliance and creating a new routine, whether you're working with athletes and trying to build yoga into it and starting with MFR, like usually that's the one thing that they'll commit to. So I often, if, whether they're an athlete or not, if they're coming in for a shoulder injury or something else, like I usually start with the MFR, and, I encourage our teachers to too, because it's just the easiest way to get people to create that new routine and commit to it, because that's one of the hardest things we do as yoga teachers. If you're working with people therapeutically, one of the hardest things you do unanimously is getting people to do the work on their own. You know, you're maybe giving them one or two poses, even if they come in and they're like, I want an hour to do every day. Like, great. I'm excited for the enthusiasm. Here's two poses. I want you to start with that. We'll build on. Like, and then they come back and they did it like 2 of the 5 days. And that's okay. We're all human. Like, we all do it. You are not alone. I do it. You do it. You do it. We do it. You just have to build a new routine. It doesn't happen instantly 99% of the time. And so MFR is that gateway drug. It's like it gets you in the door of yoga, and then you can start to build onto it. And, you know, there's some great research around it. We talk on MFR more on the other podcasts on here, but it's great for DOMs. And I like to do it like at the end of a hard workout with athletes, you know, after their hard workouts or after their hard day, very gently, because if you do this and you start drilling in there with those spicy balls, spicy balls. Wow. Okay. That one didn't work out. Sometimes they work, but
unexpected turn there.
When you're drilling in there, like, you can also make tissues more sore. Right.
And you might be inadvertently upregulating the nervous system as well, which is kind of the exact opposite of what you're trying to do at that point.
Exactly. So we know that it can be great for DOMs. We know that it's great for mobility. It's somewhat temporary, and the research kind of shifts on how long that effect lasts. So, you know, a lot of times with athletes with mobility deficits, so at some point with repetitive motions, we've talked about, like, there can be mobility deficits even in a running stride or even in a small range of motion with a pitcher, or, you know, if there are mobility deficits, doing it before training can be a great thing, but I want to do it right before. And, you know, and then go do it in the context of a full warm up too. And it's great because, unlike stretching, we don't have performance deficits from it, or so the research suggests. So it's a great one for mobility. It's a great one for enhancing connective tissues, resilience, because we know that that's where a lot of the injuries happen. It's great for minimizing soreness. So, I mean, and it just for buy-in, there's so many great reasons to use MFR with athletes. And I believe, you know, I think some people will say, I've heard lately, like, is MFR yoga? Well, you know, maybe not to a traditionalist, but to me, anything that enhances that mind-body connection, that mindfulness, anything where I can kind of bring it in as a tool, whether that's to enhance my work with athletes in their yoga practice, to loosen them up so that they can actually move more easily through some of those poses, make it more accessible, or their sport. To me, I mean, it's all just slightly different tools. So
yeah, and I don't think, I mean, there's pressure. There's still pressure in yoga poses, right? I mean, and we're leaning into the block, or we're using it against our forehead in more restorative poses. There's still, and even just pressure of you against yourself, there is still compression, and these forces are still happening in the tissues. Even when we're not using a myofascial ball, we're just being more specific about it. And I think the teachings of yoga and the noticing and the non-judgmental awareness that we have all of those things. MFR is really able to teach us and see and feel in a way that makes it so much more obvious. It takes this really subtle experience and turns the volume up so that you can hear it, so that you can experience it, so that you can appreciate it. So I think it's such a powerful tool for in a yoga practice to really help to experience and amplify the effects of the practice, so that you notice things that you might not have felt before.
I love that. I was just about to say amplifies mindfulness, because it does. And honestly, whether we're talking about athletes or not, I actually love doing MFR and then meditating. Like, there's something really beautiful, and you don't even have to do it very long, just finding one spot, because there's really this magnified mindfulness that comes from it. That's really cool. Like you were saying about, you know, doing one side and then noticing. I love that. Yeah.
And think about how, like, extra true this could be from the standpoint of an athlete who, let's assume that the majority of people who like engage in a sport in a significant capacity are probably pretty kinesthetically oriented. Like, that's what really lights up their nervous system, is like sensation and movement. So this idea of MFR acting as a kind of gateway drug to like deeper self-awareness, like a better self-knowledge, and that kind of mindful and introspective headspace. I mean, could there be a more perfect modality to help as like the stepping stone to that, when it's checking all of those boxes and providing the long-term, like the big picture benefits as well, outside of just that single moment as well.
Absolutely. So now we get to the really obvious one. I feel like this was what I remember people, back in, when I started at Nike in 2006 or so, people really bought into the cross training. People hadn't bought into recovery yet. And MFR wasn't really as big back then. I don't remember, I used MFR with my patients, but I don't ever remember using it in a yoga setting back then. And, but cross training, like, I feel like it's another one that's such a big selling point for athletes, such a big helpful thing. Just getting them to move in different orientations is a form of cross training, right? And it can be a lot of different things.
Yeah. And I think, especially when I started to think about it in the context of this conversation that we're having right now, it really, became even more obvious to me just how many different things cross training can mean, because, Allison was talking about it in the vernacular of this very specific demographic of like endurance runners that she works with. And in that particular group, cross training means getting on a bike.
Going for a swim. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's doing
more
some
sagittal movement.
Yes, exactly. Doing similar movement, but in like a slightly different setting or minus the impact. But then of course, it's going to be so different, not like for individual athletes and individual sports. I mean, I think that, we can broadly apply core stability as a really useful cross-training point of focus, but even that's going to be super different. There's sports where, if you're deadlifting like a really heavy weight, your core stability had better mean complete rigidity and total ability to resist movement of any kind in your core. If you're playing an impact sport, well, you actually need a little bit of that same rigidity, but not too much, because otherwise the impact just causes you to fall over, which obviously puts you at a competitive disadvantage. So you want a combination of some resistance, some rigidity with a little bit of fluidity, that ability to absorb impact. So it's going to look really different from one person to another. And even just things like I would consider balance training and anything that enhances proprioception and body awareness. We know from research that these are things that are correlated to lower injury rates, especially I was reading a study just a couple of days ago about how, I forget what the exact percentage was, but it was like 60 or 70% of all sports injuries are in the lower extremity. So if we can improve our ankle stability and like our single leg stability, we can that's something that we can apply across the board to athletes, and it's probably going to have a positive outcome. And then of course, depending on, I'm sure Allison comes across this all the time, but rotator cuff injuries in overhead sports like weightlifting and CrossFit are so common. And I just find that a lot of the time, if we were to just cross train a little bit by making sure that the athletes have access to that passive range of motion, and then developing the muscular control in that position when it's being used repetitively and often under heavy load, then we can very effectively cross train down the potential for injury in those vulnerable sport specific positions as well. So there's so many different angles that we can take with this.
Well, and again, I think you're talking about too, there can be very specific cross training work for movement specific, but we can also sometimes it's just like doing weird shit in a yoga class,
just moving in some way that is different,
which for an athlete, like down dog is some weird stuff, right? That can be very awkward for an athlete. It can be one of the hardest poses, I think, for athletes that we do a lot in a yoga class. It's so challenging. And so moving in new weird ways, like learning to kind of get comfortable with balance and flexibility and proprioception, which is one thing we didn't actually mention with MFR, but with MFR is a great way to enhance proprioception. And, and I think just training different muscle groups, we're more tuned into with a lot of the work that we do in a yoga setting, more of the deeper, more stabilizing, just for generality, I'm generalizing here, but versus like the large superficial power muscles that are, trained more unanimously in athletes. What we're looking at is these smaller muscles that are made to really stabilize and support the joints. So they create a protective mechanism really for athletes, learning how to train both of them, because when they're working together, it's, kind of presetting the joints so that those larger massive muscles can actually be more powerful movers, as well as now more protective for the joint at the same time. So, training stability and new movement patterns, I think is a really important thing. And again, I think this is a really well accepted in most, if not all sports, the importance of it. I think of like Tiger Woods back in the day, and like he was so notorious for cross training. And golf, you don't really think of as like, it's physical, clearly physical, but it's a different kind of physicality than like a football player where, you just assume you have to have all that stuff. But even in things like golf, like all of these sports need some type of cross training.
Yeah, and I'm always reminded I'm always like constantly reminded when I work with my athletes about the fact that often they just getting them to experience a particular movement or joint position that is something that they frequently utilize in their sport, but getting them to notice it in a different context where maybe we're moving a little bit slower, maybe we're being really intentional about the way we engage the muscles in that position, that puts a whole new perspective on this thing that's already really familiar for them. And it can be so revelatory. And in my mind, that's a form of cross training as well, because the big picture with cross training, in my opinion, is really to do with just maintaining your capabilities as a well-rounded, versatile mover and a competent user of your body. And I think, depending on where you are on the scale, as far as like a very casual athlete or like a more high-level elite athlete, really you're just trying to find that balance between being like versatile and well-rounded, but still having those sport specific capabilities and just kind of like fine tuning where you are on that scale. And I'm sure Allison has something to add to that.
Yeah. I mean, I think cross training is like the crux of durability. Like it is training for durability. It is maintaining. I mean, for me, I've been a hybrid athlete for a couple of years, and I work with a lot of hybrid athletes. And when I say that, I mean, they don't know how to pick just one. So they do endurance and they do strength. And we know that in those types of environments, you are training your system to do two very different things. And so you give a little bit on performance to hold on to the ability to do multiple things. Because at this point, I'm not a competitive athlete. I just really enjoy being competitive with myself and doing both of these things. And I find that they complement each other. And a lot of my athletes feel the same. All of my endurance athletes also lift weights. So, with that, we're adding this modality in this case, it's weightlifting or, the recovery aspect of yoga, or the myofascial release, or these things that we're doing, we're adding them in to really enhance our ability to have, like Jenni said, that the right amount of specificity for what we want to do to perform in the way we want to perform, but as much versatility to still be able to do these things. Because recreational athletes that I work with, a lot of them get hurt not in their sport. They get hurt doing other things like playing Frisbee with their kids or trying to skateboard, and so
it's just a reminder of like you're good at what you train for, that law of specificity.
But there might be something missing if you're not a trail runner. If you're a road runner, you're used to running on a very stable, flat surface. You might not have the foot and ankle strength that would be, serve you well standing on your kid's skateboard or trying to cut side to side. So, there's this this addition of yoga as cross training and getting people to move in different ways, I think, is a preservation of your ability to move and to be durable for whatever it
For
is
life.
that. Yeah, exactly.
For life,
Beyond
because even if you are a pro athlete, every pro athlete I've worked with still wants to feel good when they're like with their family or picking up their kids or, you know, doing the things. And, you know, of course, if you're a pro athlete, it's your livelihood. So maybe number one is your sport, although I think family is always somewhere close in there for most, even pro athletes, but like, you still want all the other things. We all still want all those. And so, you know, it's never just about sport. It's also about life. It's also about career longevity and longevity beyond that too. How are we going to feel after our career is over, potentially in sports where, you know, they do end at some point. You know, obviously some sports you can do for a very long time, and hopefully people stay active for a very long time because that'll help durability after sport. But yeah, I think there's a lot of important details there. And I want to just jump to some like really important, like this will be the speed round of like quick takeaways, both for athletes and for teachers, because we've covered some big things. I think there's a lot of really great things. And, you know, we could talk on any one of these topics. I know any one of us could probably talk on one of these topics for a very long time. And I know in our teacher training, our Yoga for Athletes training, we talk a lot on the science and the details and the nuances behind all of this. And, you know, there's a lot more detail. So I don't want to brush over it without just having that caveat because, you know, it's important to remember that there's more to it, but there's a lot of really important quick takeaways, right? Like, you know, I think there's a lot of just quick little things that we want to keep in mind when we're using yoga for athletes too.
Did you mean in like a particular regard in terms of how we work with them?
Speed round. Sorry, I just kind of left it there. So I'll do the drum roll. Like, what are our most important points for athletes and for working with athletes?
So I think for as a teacher working with athletes,
I love that none of us really knows where to start. We're just like, didn't we just
there's
say
so
a lot of stuff? Where do we begin? Okay. Drum roll.
So I definitely think that as a teacher working with athletes, the thing to remember is that they are looking for expert guidance, and it's important for you to legitimize yourself as an expert giving them that guidance. So I think that means communicating with them in terms that they understand, that feel relevant to their sport, demonstrating your understanding and expertise of the sport itself and not just the movements, but like the physical and the mental stressors that they deal with. And I'm not saying by any means that I think you need to perform at like a high level or at much less an elite level in the sport itself in order to teach those athletes specifically or well. But you do need to have an understanding of what they're dealing with. And without that, it would be difficult to expect them to accept guidance from you. So I do think that that's really important.
Yes. And like, obviously I was never a football player. I worked with a lot of football players. Like you watch it, you listen, you talk. And at first when I started working with them, I was talking to the coaches. I was asking people and all the way through, but at the beginning too, like really just taking it in and getting whatever I could. So I think that's a really important one. However, you know, you're probably going to be drawn to sports that you're interested in yourself, which is a great connection too, because, you know, it gives you that personal connection.
Well, that's the easiest way to establish the rapport and the trust as well. Yeah.
Through personal experience, of course. Yeah.
I think it's important that we understand, kind of piggybacking off of what Jenni said, that understanding what language is really meaningful to these athletes. So for me, I think one of the biggest ones that we can tune into really is the rate of perceived exertion that athletes are so used to so much, especially in weightlifting and in endurance sports. There are zones that we train in or RPEs that we train at. So there are certain, we go in with a programming that has either a percentage or an effort that we're supposed to give that day. So with endurance athletes in particular, We have hard days, we have easy days, we have hard and easy days. And the goal in polarized training like that is to really separate the hard and the easy days so that you're not doing medium effort days all the time and diluting your training efforts and not recovering. So with using RPE, or rate of perceived exertion, in a yoga setting, we can really frame up how much effort and intensity we want these athletes to channel into the practice that we're giving them. So we're using this meaningful language to them to help moderate how much of this, zest for their sport and they're bringing into, or how much gusto they're bringing into it, to help bring down so that they're not putting all of their effort into yoga when it really needs to be going into something else, and making sure that the recovery practices we're giving them are at a level that really allows them to relax and to recover and are not just further amplifying the system. I think with myofascial release, I've used RPE meters as well. I know, Tiffany, you use the percentage of sensation sort of thing of like 50%, or, don't go to 100, you guys, so finding a sensation level that's about a 3 out of a 10 in terms of, how much of that you're using, but finding those ways that these athletes are already looking at their training and training accordingly can help frame up how to approach a yoga practice as well in a way that really means something to them.
I love the percentage too. I love it like in an active recovery class where you're just trying to get the circulation going, like 50%. And just saying that, just the 50% thing, like I feel like most people click into that, like, oh, I'm just not fully effortful. Like,
it's permission, right? It's permission to be like, that's the goal, 50%, not 100.
Half of your capacity there. Yes. Just do half, which is a weird thing, right? Because we don't train for half. We train for full. Like even on even on light days, you might not do half. I don't know. I mean, it depends on the person, but half is, I don't know. It's a strange thing in yoga, right?
But even having just understanding that of the mentality, the mindset, like the tendency is going to be to try to go harder. Yeah. So just taking it down a couple of notches, using whatever language feels relevant. Like I like the percentages as well. I think that's something that works pretty well across the board, and giving them that understanding, which again might be something that develops over time, about the fact that the yoga practice is not the place where they need to be expending the effort. It's like, that's a total lateral move. It actually is taking away resources from your athletic training. It actually serves you better to do less here.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think also with all of the tools that we have in yoga that we talked about throughout this podcast, is understanding what the athlete is already doing allows you to really tune into the things they're not. So, I mean, some athletes, especially look at the world of endurance athletes, some of them do strength train and some of them don't strength train. And so I think there's a lot more there's a lot more tools you can use for somebody who's not already doing a strength training program that would be really beneficial for somebody who only runs or only cycles or only swims, right?
Yes.
But if this person is already doing strength training in addition to their endurance training, that's a big training load. And what they're not doing as well is recovering. You can really kind of steer their use of that time most effectively to make sure that you're covering all the bases for them, instead of just adding something more onto their to-do list that maybe isn't giving them as much additional benefit. There's so many powerful tools that we have as yoga teachers. You will be super effective if you find that one thing that they are not currently doing and give them just a little bit of it. It'll have a huge impact.
Well, and totally. On top of the fact that like time is of the essence, whether you're a professional athlete or you're just doing it to feel your best, like people are busy. So you might get a half an hour of their time or 10 minutes a day or an hour here and there. So you've really got to be able to pick and choose and find what's going to be most helpful. Because as yoga teachers, we come in and, like you do the yoga for athletes training, you have all these great things. Sometimes the hardest thing is now like honing in and picking the thing to start with, because there's so many things that you want to do with them, but time is of the essence.
And I think it totally behooves us, and it's our responsibility as teachers, like guiding athletes through this process, it's on us to give them something that they can succeed at. Like, so the best program is not going to work if it takes too much time and they end up not doing it, or if you fail to make it feel relevant to their sport or their overall athletic progress, or as Allison said, if you haven't honed in on where the gaps are and the things that they're already doing, and you can't like fulfill that particular need, that it still has to be met.
Yeah.
Sometimes
and then I think the really big one here, because we're just kind of honing it all in on these final points, is that the frequency over the duration on that note, like having them do something like honing in on the thing. Remember that time is of the essence, so that you can also give them something that they can and will repeat. And that's the success that Jenni's talking about. I have to be able. And so if you're not a teacher, if you're an athlete, I think that's the takeaway too, is finding that thing that's helpful. Don't be overwhelmed by all the other things and all the shiny objects, but like find the one thing, start with it, add it to your regimen. And then you can also see like how that one thing is influencing you. And you might find, oh, that one thing works better at this point in my training cycle than at this point. And you just have one moving part, and then you can start to add in other things. I find that that's usually a really helpful way, whether you're working with a teacher or doing this on your own. I know if you're an athlete and not a teacher, there's a lot of great platforms, whether you're on Allison's or Jenni's or you're on Yoga Medicine Online. Like if I can bring some of that mindfulness into it and find something I can repeat, that's where I'm going to find that success. And then, I just have to be ready to pivot, right? When it's not working, like don't force yourself. Like if you're really enjoying this MFR technique and it's working, but all of a sudden it's not, maybe things have shifted, or maybe it's a different point in your training cycle. So listen and evolve. As a teacher, same thing. Be ready to pivot based on what's happening with your athlete, whether their training cycles are changing, whether their body's changing, whether their needs are changing, whatever that might be. I have to be ready to shift gears. And that's the great thing about yoga, is you've got like 5 million tools in your pocket, right? It's just picking a different one. All right. I'm going to do a quick summary. Anything else you guys want to add for the key points to keep in mind? Any last? And then I'll do a quick summary.
I would just say that sometimes they come to you for one purpose, and they seem very clear about what they want, but do that investigation anyway, because at the end of the day, they are coming to you for your expertise, and to just look at what they're doing with their critical eye and provide what you have, which is your knowledge and expertise of all of these different tools. They might not know that these things are available to them, and that they're so easy for them to do and to repeat, easier than even some of the things they may have heard of. So be willing to have an opinion, to state an opinion on what you think is missing. These are people that are used to other people providing impact on what's happening. So just be willing to give that opinion as well.
And I'll add to that, which is kind of like a slightly different angle on the same thing. If somebody has a very strong opinion about what they want to do, even if I have a different opinion, like sometimes the means will help you to get to the end. So like I'll cut bait and give them the thing that they want, but then they're also getting the other stuff. And maybe sometimes it's just a bit more of a process. And it involves like some education and the experience of like, oh, that works happening along the way. So you can split the difference there as far as giving them what they think that they need and what they actually need to.
I love it. So I think we've got some really great takeaways. One, I think we just mentioned too, is this kind of letting it be a process. Part of it is educating them. They don't need to be a yoga teacher, but planting little seeds, because your relationship with an athlete, if you are a yoga teacher, is going to change as they change and as they learn and as they start to understand more of what you can do. You don't need to do it all at once. Start where they're at. And part of it is just creating that baseline. I think for yoga for athletes, it's like, it really is very much just yoga for beginners and tight people, making it accessible, make it simple, get them familiar with it. When I coach people who are working with teams or professional athletes, it's like, well, the first part's almost pretty easy because you're just getting them kind of familiar with the things that you already know and giving them those things so that you can start to build a toolkit for them. So I'm educating them. And as an athlete, it's the flip side too, is like you're educating yourself by being mindful of how all of these different techniques affect you. I think this is the beauty of yoga, both in healthcare as well as in athletics, is that it creates this foundation of mindfulness, which really allows us to be the architect of our experience. We get to decide what we're creating rather than just, watch and see and hope and cross your fingers. So, I think educating, learning that mindfulness is very important. How do I adapt my practice? And using some of those tools is a big part of it. Remembering it's not your sport. This is not your sport. Drawing that clear line, as we talked about with Allison earlier, like we are leaving the sport, we are heading into a different realm. Maybe it's recovery realm. Maybe there's a different purpose. But being clear on your purpose, and you might not, you're not going to have all the details from one podcast episode, but you might have a little bit more than you did before. And as you study and learn, you might have some more, and you can layer in some nuances there. We talked about the importance of tissue stiffness and tension. That it is not inherently a bad thing, but it is a very precious commodity. Just like the Goldilocks scenario, like we don't want too much or too little of this stiffness, because we don't want to actually become rigid. We want to still have good mobility of the tissues to a certain extent, but we want to have that precious tension to be able to be efficient in our sport. Recovery is critical. We talked a lot about that. We talked about the use. We talked a little bit about the uses and applications of cross training. I think that one's the more obvious one, just moving in different directions, using MFR as a potent tool for whether that be for DOMs or for just connective tissue health, minimizing injuries, mindfulness, proprioception. We talked about a bunch of things. Frequency over duration. If you find something helpful, repeat it. Be willing to adapt as needed with your training cycle, with your recovery. And then there's just so many ways to use this. What I love about yoga for athletes is that there's so many tools, whether you're looking to enhance recovery, whether you're looking to optimize pH with breath work, whether you're using MFR for DOMs or mobility work or active recovery, or you're training the deep stabilizers, whether you're trying to work on balance or cross training, or we didn't even talk about like mental training in yoga, which is a huge part of it, training for the zone, training for that focus. Or if it's just giving back to your body, that does so much for you, right? Like, especially as an athlete, but even as a human. I just love that there's so many tools in a yoga practice, and you don't need to be overwhelmed by it. I know we planted a lot of seeds today, but I hope that it'll inspire you, even if it's just tiny little mindset changes of how you see yourself in a yoga practice, of how you see the yoga practice serving you rather than you serving your practice, of how you apply some of these things and maybe shift your mindset. Know that I think any one of those small changes can make a really big impact. It's the small things that we do all the time that really leave a big impact on us. And, as a yogi, whatever level you're at, new or experienced, bringing that mindfulness to especially to your cross training and recovery can be such a valuable resource. So if you're looking for more tools, I know I've mentioned it already, but we've got lots more. We go into all of the details and all of this, and our yoga for athletes training, looking at the science and the details and the nuances. And I've got Allison and Jenni there leading some specific topics and their specialties, and a few other teachers there. And just a wealth of knowledge to draw from. If you're interested in working with athletes or already do, it's a great resource. Otherwise, there's always more information coming on the podcast. We love to hear your thoughts. We love to hear your requests. If you have topics you want to talk on. Oh, and we also have, I think Jenni's you've got a powerlifting. Is that what it's called? Yoga for powerlifters? Weightlifters.
For weightlifting athletes. Yeah.
Weightlifting athletes. Yeah. And I know Jenni and Allison both have their businesses that are really recovery support specific. And they're also both on Yoga Medicine Online. If you want to check out some of their classes on our practice site. What did I miss? That was a mouthful.
We jammed a lot into that.
I'm like cramming a few last bits in there. What else?
Well, yes. I was just going to add that, I think you said, Tiffany, that it's great that we covered so many different tools and different aspects of working with athletes. And I really believe that the sort of mindfulness component is the thread that runs through all of that. And that's almost like the biggest gift that you can give to your students, because that's something that they can just keep and apply to everything. It gives them the ability, it gives them the autonomy to make decisions on their own and to make these informed decisions about what's going to be working for them, what feels right for them in that moment, what their body needs at that particular point in time. So I think if we can instill that sense of paying attention, and then be trusting and being able to interpret that information, that's the single most valuable thing that we can give to our students, that they keep forever, even after you stop working with them. So I think that's really such a critical part of it.
Because ultimately it's up to you as an athlete. I mean, even you're even choosing your coach. You're choosing how you prioritize recovery. You're choosing what you want to prioritize to support how you want to feel or perform, or it's all up to us. So I agree.
Yeah. And as athletes, we're making on the fly decisions all the time about how much we have left in the tank, how much discomfort we can handle, all of these things. There's constantly so much information that we have to be able to take in the middle of the storm, and then make these decisions about what we're going to do next. Do I pull out of the race? Do I finish the race? Do I push through? Do I stop to walk? Do I try to lift a little bit more? Whatever the case may be, that present moment awareness, that ability to separate yourself from the judgment of what you are experiencing and just see it with a more rational mindset, is such a valuable component of every sport that I've ever participated or competed in. It is like Jenni said, it is this thread that isn't necessarily being trained by anyone else. And as yoga teachers, we have all the tools that we need to really give people this gift that will serve them in their competitive career, in their life, in their post-competitive career. Really is such an important component of what we have to offer.
I love that. And I love you kind of painted this picture for me that kind of summarizes a lot of this. For me, it's kind of all that work, you're all the decisions, all the stuff you're doing. I'm picturing all this scribbling on a whiteboard, all this stuff. And then for me, yoga's coming and clearing that whiteboard, not only in the sense that we're down regulating their nervous system and bringing in that parasympathetic response to help enhance recovery, but that in and of itself, that kind of clearing the whiteboard is the preparation for their next training session too. It kind of creates a nice analogy, because I always think about the recovery as also the preparation for their training. It's instead of turning off your computer, just yanking it out, right? We want to guide that process. And so yoga has such a critical piece in this. And I hope you guys enjoy experimenting with some of these concepts and ideas, and knowing that there's always more to learn at Yoga Medicine. We're such fans of embracing the mystery, living in the experiment, finding what's right for you. And this is actually what I love about sports medicine is there's so many different opinions, and that's brilliant because each body's different. So we get to navigate it with that mindfulness to find what is right for us, which is the beauty of it all. So I hope you guys have enjoyed the episode. Thank you, Jenni and Allison. It's been a pleasure to chat. And again, you can find more about them. You can find their bios on Yoga Medicine Online. And then I think, what are your websites? You guys want to just name, where can
Mine
people
is my
find you?
name. Mine is www.allisonheilig.com.
Heilig.
That's correct. Yep.
Mine is.
Oh, and Allison is one L.
It is
Just
one.
Yes.
Pointing that out. There it is. Sorry. Go ahead, Jenni.
Mine is a little bit more complicated. It's Kari Prehab. So KAARI and then the word prehab.com.
Great resources. Thank you guys. And I look forward to our next episode. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.